Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't carved by knives, but by the cruel words of those who should have offered kindness. In a world that judges worth by appearances, Martha had learned to measure her value in shame. Behind the stock pens of a dusty frontier town, mountain man Silas McGraw found her a broken woman sleeping among pigs because the townspeople had convinced her that's all she deserved. Once, the daughter of a prosperous rancher, Martha had lost everything when her family fell to ruin. The townsfolk mocked her weight and cast her aside like refuse. When Silas knelt beside her and asked in his deep, gentle voice, "Why are you sleeping with pigs?" something stirred in his weathered heart. He lifted her from the muck and carried her to his mountain cabin, where the only judgment came from the wind through the pines. But what would it take for a woman who'd been told she was worthless to believe she deserved a mountain man's devoted love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silas McGraw had lived 40 years on this earth, and 30 of them had been spent in the high country, where the air ran thin and clean, where a man's worth wasn't measured by the cut of his coat or the size of his purse, but by whether he could read the weather in a cloud's shadow and start a fire in a driving rain. His hands bore the calluses of honest work-axe handles and rifle stocks, the reins of pack mules, and the rough bark of pine trees he'd climbed to scout the valleys below. The mountain had been both sanctuary and teacher. It had shown him patience in the slow growth of aspens, strength in the granite faces that weathered centuries of storms, and solitude that wasn't loneliness but a deep, abiding peace. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of blue spruce, built with his own hands from trees he'd felled and seasoned, chinked with mud and moss, warmed by a stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows across walls lined with his worn leather journal. That journal held pressed wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and mountain laurel, sketched alongside careful drawings of elk tracks and weather patterns. Most men would see it as the hobby of an old bachelor gone soft, but Silas understood it as evidence of a world too beautiful to let pass unrecorded. He'd filled 3 such journals over the years, each one a testament to seasons watched and solitude embraced. But solitude, he'd learned, could grow heavy as winter snow on a cabin roof. There were evenings when the silence felt less like peace and more like absence, when he'd catch himself setting 2 plates out of habit that had never formed, or speaking aloud to his horses because the sound of his own voice had grown strange in his ears. That's what had drawn him down from the high country this particular evening in late summer, when the aspens had begun their first tentative turn toward gold, and the air carried that crisp promise of autumn. He'd told himself he needed supplies, coffee beans and salt pork, maybe a new pair of boots from the cobbler. But truth was, he needed to hear human voices, to remember that he was part of a larger world than wind and wildlife. The town of Cedar Falls had grown since his last visit, spreading like spilled water across the valley floor. New buildings crowded the main street, a hotel with glass windows that caught the evening light, a barber shop with a red-striped pole, and what looked like the beginnings of a proper church, its frame skeleton rising against the darkening sky. But growth hadn't brought kindness. As Silas rode his buckskin gelding down the rutted main street, he heard it in the laughter that followed, certain folks' laughter with sharp edges, meant to cut. He saw it in the way people stepped aside for some and crowded closer to others, creating invisible lines that divided the worthy from the unwanted. Behind Murphy's General Store, where the stock pens held cattle waiting for the morning drive, Silas caught sight of something that stopped him cold. At first, he thought it was a bundle of old rags tossed carelessly near the pig pen. Then the bundle moved, and he realized it was a woman. She lay curled on her side in the trampled straw, her dress once blue, he thought, though it was hard to tell through the grime torn at the shoulder and stained with mud. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face that might have been pretty once, before hunger and despair had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones. She was a large woman, soft in the way that spoke of better times, when food was plentiful and worry was a stranger. The pigs regarded her with the indifferent curiosity of creatures who'd grown used to her presence. One, a spotted sow with intelligent eyes, lay pressed against the woman's back, as if offering what comfort a pig could give. Silas dismounted slowly, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. The woman didn't stir, though he could see the rise and fall of her breathing. She was alive, then, but something in her stillness spoke of a deeper weariness than sleep. As he drew closer, he caught fragments of the conversations drifting from the store's back door. Men's voices, casual and cruel. "Still out there with them hogs, is she? Where else would something like that belong? Her daddy would roll over in his grave, seeing what she's come to. Daddy should have put her on a diet years ago. Maybe she wouldn't have eaten up the whole ranch." The laughter that followed made Silas's jaw tighten. He'd heard such talk before, the easy cruelty of people who measured worth by appearance and found satisfaction in another's misfortune. It was the kind of talk that drove men to the mountains, seeking something cleaner than human nature. The woman stirred as his shadow fell across her, and she looked up with eyes that held more wariness than hope. They were brown eyes, he noticed, deep as creek water in shade, though dulled now with exhaustion and something that looked like acceptance of whatever fresh humiliation was coming her way. "Mom," he said softly, removing his hat. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, rusty from days of talking only to his horses. She struggled to sit up, pushing herself away from the pig that had been warming her back. The movement revealed more of her torn dress, and Silas quickly looked away, focusing on her face instead. "I'm not causing trouble," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll move along, if you need the space." "Not my space to need," Silas replied. "I was just wondering if you might be hurt, or hungry." The question seemed to surprise her. She blinked several times, as if trying to make sense of words that didn't match her expectations. "I know, I'm fine, thank you." But even as she said it, her stomach gave a long, low growl that spoke of days without proper food. Color rose in her cheeks, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if she could muffle the sound of her own need. "When did you last eat?" Silas asked gently. She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "I get by. People sometimes throw scraps." The words hit him like a physical blow. Scraps, like she was no better than the pigs she sheltered with. "What's your name?" "Martha," she said after a moment's hesitation, as if she wasn't sure she deserved to claim even that much. "Martha," he repeated, and the way he said it with respect, like she was a person worth knowing, brought tears to her eyes. "I'm Silas McGraw, and I'd like to know, if you don't mind my asking, why a woman would choose to sleep with pigs when there's a whole wide world out here." It was the question that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Martha looked at him for a long moment, this tall, weathered man with kind eyes and calloused hands, this stranger who'd asked her name like it mattered. "Because," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word, "they're the only creatures in this town that don't look at me like I'm something disgusting." Silas felt something shift in his chest, like a mountain avalanche that starts with just one stone. He looked at this broken woman, saw past the grime and the torn dress and the soft curves that others mocked, and recognized something he'd been searching for without knowing it. Someone who understood what it meant to be judged and found wanting by a world that prized the wrong things. "Well then," he said, extending his hand to help her up, "maybe it's time you met someone who sees different." Martha stared at Silas's outstretched hand, as if it were a snake that might strike. No one had offered her help in so long that she'd forgotten what kindness looked like when it came without conditions or cruel laughter following behind. "I don't think you understand," she said, not taking his hand. I mean, look at me. Really look." Silas didn't flinch. His grey eyes took her in with the same steady attention he might give to tracking deer sign or reading weather patterns. No disgust twisted his features. No mockery lurked behind his expression. just patient consideration, as if he were seeing something others had missed. "I'm looking," he said simply. "I see a woman who's been treated poorly by folks who should know better. I see someone who's hungry and tired and deserves better than sleeping in pig straw." Martha's breath caught. She pressed her hand to her pocket, feeling the small weight of her mother's wedding ring wrapped in a piece of cloth, the only thing of value she had left, the only proof that someone had once loved her enough to promise forever. She'd kept it hidden, afraid the townspeople would take even that small comfort from her. "You don't know what they say about me," she whispered. "What I've done." "What have you done?" Silas asked, and his voice held genuine curiosity, not judgment. Martha looked down at her hands, dirt caked under her fingernails, her palms soft from lack of honest work. "I got fat," she said bitterly. "I ate my family into poverty. I drove away every man who might have married me. I'm a disgrace to decent people." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam. All the accusations she'd heard, whispered and shouted, all the shame she'd swallowed, until it had become part of her. But saying them aloud to this stranger somehow took away their power to cut quite so deep. Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching her with those steady grey eyes. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not the cruel laughter she'd grown used to, but something warm and genuine. "Well," he said, "that's about the biggest pile of nonsense I've heard since a man in Denver tried to sell me a horse that could supposedly count to 20. Martha's head snapped up. "What? You heard me?" Silas crouched down beside her, bringing himself to her level. "Martha, I've spent 30 years in these mountains, and I've learned to read sign. Animal tracks, weather patterns, the character of a man by how he treats his horse. And what I'm reading here tells me you've been fed a steady diet of lies." He gestured toward the pigs. "These animals don't lie. They don't judge. They wouldn't accept you sleeping among them if you were truly as terrible as these people claim. Animals know character better than most humans do." Martha felt tears threatening again. "But I am fat. I am alone. Those things are true." "So?" Silas shrugged. "I'm ugly as a tree stump and twice as stubborn. Been alone for so long I sometimes forget how to talk to people. Does that make me worthless?" Despite everything, Martha felt her lips twitch toward what might have been a smile. "You're not ugly. See there, you're already seeing clearer than the folks in this town." Silas stood and again extended his hand. "Come on, let me get you somewhere warm and dry, somewhere you can wash up and eat a proper meal." "I can't pay you," Martha said quickly. "I don't have anything to offer. Did I ask for payment? Men always want something." Silas's expression sobered. "I reckon some do. But right now, all I want is to see you safe and fed. We can sort out the rest later." Martha looked at his hand again, calloused but clean, steady and patient. Behind them, she could hear more laughter from the store, more casual cruelty at her expense. The pigs grunted softly, settling in for the night, but they couldn't protect her from the cold that was coming, or from the men who sometimes thought a woman sleeping rough was fair game for whatever they had in mind. Slowly, she reached out and took Silas's hand. His grip was warm and firm, and when he helped her to her feet, he did it gently, as if she were made of something precious rather than shameful. For a moment, they stood face to face in the gathering dusk, and Martha found herself looking up into eyes that held no judgment, only a quiet strength that made her feel safer than she had in years. "My horse is just around front," Silas said. "Can you ride?" "I used to," Martha said, before everything changed." "Good, we'll go slow." As they walked toward the front of the store, Martha caught sight of her reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back was almost unrecognizable, hair matted, dress torn, face gaunt with hunger and hollow with despair. She looked like exactly what the townspeople said she was, a creature more fit for pig pens than human company. But beside her reflection stood Silas McGraw, tall and solid, and unashamed to be seen with her. And for the first time in years, Martha wondered if maybe, just maybe, the person she saw in the glass wasn't the whole truth about who she was. "I should warn you," she said, as they reached his horse, a solid buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes. "If people see you helping me, they'll talk. They'll say things about you too." Silas checked the girth strap and shortened the stirrups. "Let them talk. I've been the subject of gossip before, survived it just fine." "But why?" Martha asked, the question that had been burning in her chest since he'd first spoken her name with kindness. "Why help someone like me?" Silas paused in his preparations and looked at her directly. "Because everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, not who other people decide they are. And because," he added more quietly, "I know what it's like to be judged and found wanting." He helped her mount the horse, his hands respectful, his movements careful. Martha hadn't been on horseback in years, but the familiar feel of it came back to her, the rhythm of the animal beneath her, the sense of being carried rather than struggling forward on her own weary feet. As they rode out of town, the voices from the store grew fainter, replaced by the evening sounds of the wilderness crickets beginning their night songs, the distant call of an owl, the soft thud of hoofbeats on packed earth. The mountain air was cooler and cleaner than the dusty atmosphere of the town, and Martha found herself breathing deeper than she had in months. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My place," Silas said simply. "Up in the high country. It's not much, but it's peaceful. No one to bother you or make you feel small." Martha closed her eyes and let herself imagine it a place where she could exist without shame, where the only judgment came from wind and weather rather than cruel tongues. It seemed too good to be true, too wonderful to hope for. But as they climbed the winding mountain trail, leaving the lights of Cedar Falls far below, Martha allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe her life was about to change in ways she'd never dared to dream. The cabin appeared through the pine trees like something from a dream Martha had given up hoping for. Built of solid logs chinked with clay and moss, it sat in a natural clearing where wildflowers grew thick among the grass. A stone chimney rose from the peaked roof, and warm yellow light spilled from windows that looked out on a view of peaks that stretched to the horizon. "It's beautiful," Martha whispered, and meant it. Silas dismounted and helped her down, his hands steady at her waist. "Built it myself," he said with quiet pride. "Took the better part of 3 years, working between seasons." Inside, the cabin was both rustic and comfortable. Hand-hewn furniture, well-made and sturdy. Shelves lined with books and his leather journals. A stone fireplace where embers glowed red in the grate. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately, who took care with his surroundings and found beauty in simplicity. "Sit," Silas said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "I'll get some food started." Martha perched on the edge of the chair, afraid to fully settle in case this kindness proved temporary. She watched as Silas moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, building up the fire, filling a kettle with water from a hand pump, slicing thick pieces of bread and cheese. "When did you last have a hot meal?" he asked, without turning around. Martha had to think. "I'm not sure." "A few days, maybe longer." Silas nodded but didn't press for details. Instead, he set a plate before her, simple food, but more than she'd seen in weeks. Bread, cheese, cold meat, and an apple that looked like it had been picked that very day. "Eat slow," he advised gently. "Your stomach's probably forgotten what plenty feels like." Martha took a small bite of bread, and the taste of it, yeasty and rich with butter, nearly made her weep. She'd grown so used to hunger that she'd forgotten food could be pleasure instead of just survival. While she ate, Silas busied himself with small tasks, giving her space to adjust to being indoors, being safe, being treated like a guest rather than an unwanted burden. He checked the fire, tidied already neat shelves, and eventually settled into the chair across from her with his own simple meal. "Tell me about before," he said quietly. "Before things got hard." Martha paused, a piece of cheese halfway to her mouth. "Why?" Because I'd like to know who you were when the world was kinder to you. The simple request nearly undid her. When had anyone last asked about her hopes, her memories, the person she'd been before shame became her daily companion? My father owned the Triple Creek Ranch, she said slowly. We ran cattle, had good grazing land about 20 miles south of town. It wasn't the biggest spread, but it was prosperous. My mother, she died when I was 15, but before that, we were happy. What happened to the ranch? Martha's hands tightened around her plate. Drought first, 3 years of it, then cattle disease. My father borrowed money to keep going, mortgaged everything. When he died last winter, there was nothing left but debt. And the people in town blamed you for that. They said I ate too much, cost too much to feed. Said if my father hadn't had to support a daughter who'd never find a husband, he might have made different choices. Martha's voice grew smaller. Maybe they were right. Silas set down his food and leaned forward. Martha, look at me. Reluctantly, she met his eyes. Drought and disease killed your father's ranch. Not you. Not how much you weigh or what you look like. Weather and bad luck, things no person can control. But I could have, what? Eaten less? Worked more? Made yourself smaller to please people who were looking for someone to blame? Silas shook his head. That's not how responsibility works. Your father chose to mortgage his land because he was trying to save it. That's what a man does when something matters to him. The fact that it didn't work out doesn't make it your fault. Martha stared at him. This mountain man who spoke sense like it was the most natural thing in the world. She'd carried the weight of her family's failure for so long that the idea of setting it down felt foreign, almost frightening. I don't know how to stop feeling responsible, she admitted. Takes time, Silas said, like healing from any other kind of wound. After they finished eating, Silas showed her where she could wash. He'd heated water in a large pot and poured it into a basin, providing soap that smelled like pine and clean towels that were soft from use. I'll be outside checking on the horses, he said, giving her privacy. Alone, Martha looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The face, looking back, was still gaunt, still marked by hard living, but clean water and gentle soap worked their own kind of magic. As she washed away layers of grime, she began to remember what she'd looked like before desperation became her constant companion. When Silas returned, he carried something in his hands, a wooden comb, beautifully carved with a pattern of leaves and vines. Made this last winter, he said, offering it to her. Hands needed something to do during the long evenings. Martha took the comb, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the careful detail of the carving. You made this? Mountain winters are long. Man learns to keep his hands busy. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. Not because of its material value, but because it had been made with care, with attention to detail, with the kind of patience that spoke of someone who found joy in creating beauty for its own sake. I can't take this, she said, though she clutched it tightly. It's not doing anyone any good sitting in my drawer, Silas replied. Besides, a woman should have proper things to care for herself with. Martha began working the comb through her tangled hair, wincing as it caught on knots and mats. But slowly, patiently, she worked through each section until her dark hair fell in clean waves around her shoulders. When she looked up, she found Silas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the hungry look she'd learned to fear from men, but something softer, more wondering. Better, she asked. You look like yourself again, he said simply. That night, Silas made up a bed for her near the fire while he took the small loft above. As Martha lay beneath clean blankets, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of night birds, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear, without hunger, without the weight of tomorrow's cruelties pressing down on her chest. And in her dreams, she was clean and fed and safe, just as she was in this mountain sanctuary where kindness wasn't conditional on her appearance or her worth as others measured it. Martha woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sounds she'd once taken for granted but had become foreign luxuries. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, painting everything in warm gold, and for a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd come to be in a real bed instead of pig straw. Then memory returned, along with a flutter of panic. Surely this kindness would prove temporary. Surely Silas would expect something in return, or grow tired of her presence, or come to his senses about helping someone the whole town considered worthless. "Morning," Silas said when she emerged from behind the blanket he'd hung for her privacy. "Sleep well?" Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. The simple question, asked without irony or hidden meaning, seemed too good to be real. "Coffee's ready. Breakfast in a few minutes." She watched him work at the stove, noting the easy competence of his movements, the way he seemed equally comfortable with domestic tasks as he was with the outdoor skills she'd observed the night before. Most men she'd known considered cooking women's work beneath their dignity. "Can I help?" she asked tentatively. "If you'd like. Can you handle eggs without breaking them?" It was such a normal question, the kind asked between equals, that Martha felt tears threaten again. "I think so. I used to cook for my father." Silas handed her a basket of eggs from his small henhouse outside. "These ladies provide well, better layers than some people are neighbors." As they worked together in the small kitchen, Martha began to relax. The tasks were familiar, comforting even. She'd forgotten how satisfying it could be to contribute something useful, to feel needed rather than merely tolerated. "You keep chickens," she observed. "And a milk cow. Old Bessie's probably wondering where her morning attention is." Silas glanced toward the door. "I usually tend the animals first thing, but didn't want to leave you alone this morning. Case you woke up thinking this was all a dream." The casual kindness of it, reshaping his routine to spare her confusion, made Martha's chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. "I did wonder," she admitted. "It's real," Silas said simply. "You're safe here." After breakfast, Martha insisted on washing the dishes while Silas tended his animals. Through the kitchen window, she watched him move among the chickens, speaking to them in low, gentle tones, checking their feed and water with the same careful attention he'd shown her. The domesticity of it stirred something in Martha. She'd thought permanently broken a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than her own survival. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be in a home where she was welcome, where her presence added to rather than detracted from the peace of the place. When Silas returned, he carried a bucket of fresh milk and wore an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Bessie was feeling chatty this morning," he said. "Sometimes I think she's lonelier than I am." "Do you get lonely?" Martha asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Silas didn't seem offended. "More than I used to," he said thoughtfully. "Man can go years thinking solitude and loneliness are the same thing. Then something changes, and he realizes they're not even close." He began straining the milk through clean cloth, his movements practiced and efficient. "What about you? Were you lonely before, or just alone?" Martha considered the question. "Both, I think. Even when my father was alive, even when we still had the ranch, I was always the fat daughter, the one who couldn't find a husband, who ate too much and cost too much to keep. I felt alone even when I wasn't actually by myself." "That's the worst kind of lonely," Silas said. "Being alone in a crowd." The understanding in his voice made Martha look at him more carefully. This man, who seemed so comfortable in his solitude, so at peace with his mountain life, what had driven him here? What kind of loneliness had he fled? "Is that why you came to the mountains?" she asked. "To escape that feeling?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, finishing with the milk before answering. "Partly, though I told myself it was about freedom, about living on my own terms." He hung the straining cloth to dry. "Truth is, I was tired of being measured against other men's ideas of what I should be. City life, civilized life, it never felt like it fit right. What did they expect you to be?" "Smaller," he said with a slight smile, in every way that mattered, less direct, more concerned with appearances, willing to compromise on things that seemed important to me. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I was never good at pretending to be something I wasn't. Martha nodded, understanding perfectly. I spent years trying to be smaller too, eating less, taking up less space, speaking more quietly. It never worked. I was still too much of everything they didn't want. Maybe, Silas said gently, the problem wasn't that you were too much. Maybe the problem was that they were too little. The words hit Martha like a physical blow, not painful, but shocking in their simple truth. She'd spent so long accepting the judgment of others that the possibility of their judgment being wrong had never occurred to her. I don't know how to think that way, she admitted. Takes practice, Silas said, like any other skill. As the days passed, Martha began to find her rhythm in the mountain sanctuary. She helped with the animals, cooked meals, tended the small garden where Silas grew vegetables and herbs. The work felt good, purposeful, and appreciated rather than merely endured. Silas proved to be an easy companion. He spoke when conversation was wanted, but didn't fill silence with unnecessary chatter. He was well-read, she discovered, his shelves holding books on everything from animal husbandry to philosophy, and in the evenings they often read by firelight, sharing passages that struck them as particularly wise or beautiful. It was during one such evening that the tranquility was shattered by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Martha's blood turned to ice water at the familiar voices carrying through the night air. "McGraw, we know you're in there." Silas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. "Town men," he said quietly. "3 of them, maybe 4. Martha shrank back into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They've come for me. Let them come." Silas moved to a cabinet and withdrew something that made Martha's breath catch a hunting knife with a bone handle, worn smooth by years of use. It was clearly a practical tool, but in his hands it looked like something more dangerous. The knife had been his father's, and his grandfather's before that, passed down through generations of McGraw men, who'd learned early that sometimes a man had to stand between what he valued and those who would take it away. "Martha Jenkins," a voice called from outside. "We know you're in there, hiding like the coward you are. Come out and face what you've done." Silas stepped to the door, his hand resting easily on the knife's handle. "What she's done," he called back, "is find herself some peace and quiet. I suggest you men do the same." "She's got no business being up here with a decent man," another voice shouted. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble, McGraw." "Verst, only trouble I see," Silas replied calmly, "is a bunch of men riding up to my property uninvited in the middle of the night." Martha crept to his side, her whole body trembling. "Please," she whispered, "I'll go with them. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Silas looked down at her, his grey eyes fierce in the firelight. "No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go," he said firmly. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." The simple declaration, "This is your home now," broke something open in Martha's chest that had been locked tight for years. Home. When had anyone last offered her that? When had she last belonged somewhere, mattered to someone, been worth protecting? "I won't let them hurt you," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "And I won't let them hurt you," Silas replied. "That's what people do for each other when they care." Outside, the voices grew more agitated, more threatening, but inside the warm circle of firelight, Martha felt something new taking root in the place where shame had lived for so long, the radical possibility that she might actually be worth defending. The confrontation with the townsman passed without violence, but it left Martha shaken in ways that went deeper than fear. As she lay awake that night, listening to Silas's steady breathing from the loft above, she found herself thinking about the way he'd stood between her and those who would drag her back to shame. No one had ever done that for her before, not her father, who'd loved her but been too worn down by his own failures to fight for her, not the young men who'd courted her briefly before her weight became socially unacceptable. The next morning brought an unusual silence between them, heavy with things unsaid. Martha went about her morning tasks, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, starting breakfast, but she could feel Silas watching her with a new kind of attention, as if the events of the previous night had shifted something fundamental between them. "We should talk," he said finally, when they'd finished eating and the morning chores were done. Martha's stomach clenched. Here it came, the conversation where he'd explained that helping her was one thing, but making enemies of the whole town was another. She'd been expecting it, had been surprised it had taken this long. "I understand," she said quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Last night changed things. I'll pack my things and—" "Martha." His voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her head. His grey eyes held no retreat, no regret, only a quiet intensity that made her heart skip. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. "I'm asking you to tell me why you're so certain I will." The question caught her off guard. She'd prepared herself for rejection, not understanding, because that's what always happens. People are kind at first, but then the cost of that kindness becomes clear, and they realize I'm not worth it. "What cost?" "Last night. Last night some fools rode up here making noise. That's not your fault." Martha stood abruptly, pacing to the window where morning light streamed through the glass. "You don't understand. This is just the beginning. They'll make your life difficult. They'll find ways to hurt your business, spread stories about you, make you an outcast like me. Eventually, you'll decide I'm not worth the trouble. Will I?" Silas's voice was calm, curious rather than defensive. "It's what happened before." The words spilled out before Martha could stop them. "There was a young man, Thomas Hartley, a few years ago, before things got really bad. He seemed to care about me, said my weight didn't matter, that he saw the person inside." Martha wrapped her arms around herself, remembering. "We courted for 3 months. I hoped that maybe I'd found someone who could love me as I was. Then the town started talking. His friends made jokes. His mother threatened to disown him. And slowly, gradually, he started pulling away." "What happened?" "He told me he cared about me, but he couldn't sacrifice his entire future for someone who would never fit into proper society. He said it wasn't fair to ask him to choose between me and everything else he wanted in life." Martha's voice grew smaller. "He was right, of course. I was asking too much." Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Martha turn from the window. "Martha, do you know why I live up here, really?" She shook her head. "Because down there," he gestured toward the distant town, "I was never allowed to be myself. I was too big, too direct, too unconcerned with the things that mattered to other people. I tried to fit in, tried to be what they expected, but it nearly killed something essential in me." He stood, moving to stand beside her at the window. "The last woman I courted this was years ago. Before I came to the mountains, she liked the idea of taming me, making me civilized. She wanted me to cut my hair, wear fancy clothes, learn to make small talk at dinner parties. Said she could help me become a proper gentleman. What did you do?" "I tried. For her, I tried to become smaller, quieter, more acceptable. Lasted about 6 months before I realized I was disappearing entirely. The man she wanted to marry wasn't me at all. It was some polished version that had nothing to do with who I really was." Silas turned to face her fully. "Thomas Hartley was a coward, Martha. He wanted you to be grateful for scraps of attention while he waited for you to transform into someone socially acceptable. That's not love, that's conditional tolerance." Martha felt tears threatening. "But what if I can't change? What if this is just who I am?" "Then this is who you are, and anyone who can't see the value in that isn't worthy of your time." Silas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he touched her cheek with one calloused finger. You think your worth depends on whether other people approve of you. But what if it doesn't? What if you're valuable just because you exist? The touch was gentle, respectful, but it sent heat racing through Martha's entire body. She couldn't remember the last time a man had touched her with tenderness instead of disgust or calculated cruelty. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered. "Then let me believe it for both of us, until you can believe it for yourself." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition that they were standing at the edge of territory neither had explored before. Martha found herself looking at Silas's mouth, wondering what it would feel like if he kissed her, wondering if she dared to want such a thing. "Silas," she said, and her voice came out husky, uncertain. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." But instead of moving closer, he stepped back, putting careful distance between them. The rejection stung, even though Martha knew it was probably wise. "It's too soon," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "You're just learning to trust that you're safe here. I won't take advantage of that." Martha nodded, though part of her wanted to protest that it wasn't taking advantage if she wanted it too. But maybe he was right. Maybe she needed to learn to value herself before she could trust someone else to value her. That afternoon, Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the mountains with an expression he couldn't quite read. In her hands, she held something wrapped in cloth, something she'd been carrying since the night he found her but had never shown him. "What's that?" he asked gently, settling beside her on the steps. Martha hesitated, then carefully unwrapped the small bundle. Inside was a simple gold wedding ring, worn thin from years of wear. "My mother's," she said softly. "She died when I was 15. This is all I have left of her, of the time when our family was happy." Silas examined the ring without touching it, respecting the intimacy of the moment. "She must have been a good woman." "She was. She used to tell me that true love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours like puzzle pieces." Martha's voice grew wistful. "She said that when you find that person, you'll know because being with them will feel like coming home." Sounds like she was wise. "I used to dream about wearing this ring someday, about having what my parents had, that easy affection, that partnership. But as I got older, as I gained weight and became less acceptable, I realized it was probably just a foolish dream." Martha wrapped the ring back in its cloth, but she held the bundle carefully, as if it contained all her abandoned hopes. "Maybe," Silas said quietly, "it's not as foolish as you think." She looked at him, searching his face for signs of pity or false comfort, but found only sincerity. The possibility that hung between them was terrifying and wonderful, in equal measure the chance that maybe, just maybe, she might not have to spend the rest of her life alone. But even as hope began to unfurl in her chest, Martha couldn't shake the memory of Thomas Hartley's final words to her. "I can't sacrifice my entire future for someone who will never fit into proper society." The question that haunted her now was whether Silas McGraw was truly different, or whether he simply hadn't yet realized what choosing her would cost him. The poster appeared 3 days later, nailed to a tree at the head of the trail that led to Silas's cabin. Martha discovered it during her morning walk to check the snares Silas had taught her to set for rabbits. At first, she thought it was just another notice about missing livestock or a town meeting. Then she saw her own name, and her blood turned to ice. Reward notice, 50 for information leading to the return of quantity. Martha Jenkins, wanted for theft of food and supplies, last seen in the company of a mountain man, known to be armed and dangerous. Below the text was a crude drawing that was unmistakably meant to be her exaggerated features that emphasized every aspect of her appearance the town found objectionable. The artist had drawn her as a grotesque caricature, more animal than human, with an expression of stupid cunning. Martha stared at the poster until her vision blurred, until the words seemed to crawl across the paper like insects. Theft, as if taking scraps thrown to her like she was a stray dog, constituted stealing. Armed and dangerous, as if her very existence posed a threat to decent people. She tore the poster down and ran back to the cabin, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Silas was splitting wood behind the house, his axe falling in steady rhythm. But he stopped the moment he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down the axe immediately. Without a word, Martha thrust the crumpled poster at him. She watched his expression darken as he read, his jaw tightening with each line. "This is what I brought to your life," Martha said, her voice hollow. "This is what caring about me costs." Silas looked up from the poster, his grey eyes blazing with an anger she'd never seen before. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled, deadly calm. "They think they can terrorize you into coming back, make you so afraid that you'll return to sleeping with pigs rather than cause me trouble. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should—" "No!" The word came out sharp as a rifle crack. "You're not going anywhere." But the reward, the lies about theft, lies are all they are. Anyone who knows you would see that immediately. Silas crumpled the poster in his fist. "This isn't about justice, Martha. This is about control. They can't stand that you found a way to escape their judgment." Martha wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the warm afternoon sun. $50 is a lot of money to some people. Someone will try to collect it. Let them try. The quiet menace in his voice should have been frightening, but instead, Martha felt a fierce surge of gratitude. This man, this good, strong man, was willing to stand against the entire town for her sake. "I can't ask you to do this," she said. "It's not fair." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Silas stepped closer, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Martha, listen to me. I've lived alone for 30 years, and I was content with that. But content isn't the same as happy. Since you've been here, I've remembered what it feels like to have someone to care for, someone to protect, someone whose happiness matters more than my own comfort. But what if they make good on their threats? What if they try to drive me out of business, make me unwelcome in town?" Silas shrugged. "I've got everything I need right here. I can hunt, fish, grow my own food. I don't need their approval to survive." Martha searched his face, looking for any sign that he was trying to convince himself as much as her. But she found only steady resolve, the kind of determination that came from a man who'd made his peace with hard choices. "Why?" she whispered. "Why is this worth it to you?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, his hands still warm on her shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because you make me want to be the kind of man worth coming home to. Because when I see you feeding the chickens in the morning, or reading by the fire at night, or laughing at something I've said when I see you happy and safe and free from their poison, I feel like I'm living instead of just surviving." The words hit Martha like a physical blow, so sweet and unexpected that she couldn't quite process them. "Silas, I know it's too soon to say such things. I know you need time to heal, to learn to trust. But I won't pretend I don't care about you, and I won't let fear of what others might do drive away the best thing that's ever happened to me." Martha felt tears spilling down her cheeks, not tears of sorrow this time, but something closer to overwhelming relief. "I care about you too, more than I thought possible, but I'm so scared." "Of what?" "Of believing this is real, of letting myself hope that someone could actually love me as I am, of trusting that you won't change your mind when the cost becomes clear." Silas cupped her face in his calloused hands, thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Then let me prove it to you. However long it takes, however many posters they nail up, however much trouble they try to cause, let me prove that you're worth all of it, and more." The kiss, when it came, was gentle and asking rather than demanding. Martha had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such reverence, such careful attention to her response. When Silas pulled back, his eyes searched hers for any sign of regret or fear. Instead, he found wonder. "I've never been kissed like that," Martha said softly. "Like what?" "Like I was something precious." "You are something precious," Silas said simply. "Most precious thing I've ever found." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing quiet conversation, Martha found herself studying Silas's face in the flickering light. The strong jaw, the weathered skin, the grey eyes that saw her so differently than anyone ever had. She was beginning to understand that this feeling, this warmth, this sense of belonging, this desire to share her thoughts and fears and dreams with another person, was what her mother had meant about coming home. But late that night, as she lay listening to the wind in the pines, Martha's mind returned to the crude drawing on the poster, to the word dangerous applied to her existence, to the $50 price on her freedom. Somewhere out there, people were already planning how to collect that reward. And when they came, not if, but when the man sleeping peacefully in the loft above would have to choose between his quiet mountain life and defending a woman the whole world seemed determined to destroy. Martha touched her mother's wedding ring through the cloth where she kept it hidden. She wanted to believe that love could overcome social pressure, that character mattered more than appearances, that she could trust in Silas's promises. But Thomas Hartley had made promises too, before the weight of judgment became too much to bear. The question that kept her awake was whether mountain-bred strength was enough to withstand the kind of sustained cruelty that had already destroyed her once, and whether she had the right to ask Silas to find out. The discovery came by accident, the way most life-changing revelations do. Martha was cleaning out an old trunk Silas had brought down from the cabin's storage loft, a trunk that had belonged to her father and somehow ended up in the mountain man's possession through a complicated series of debts and estate sales that had followed the ranch's collapse. "Figured you might want to see if there's anything in there worth keeping," Silas had said when he'd carried it down that morning. "No pressure if it's too painful. We can just store it away again." But Martha found herself drawn to the trunk, like a woman dying of thirst, drawn to water. Inside were the remnants of her old life, her mother's sewing basket, a few books, some faded photographs of better times. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a false bottom she'd never known existed, were papers. Legal documents, land deeds, and something that made Martha's hands shake as she read it. A mining claim registration for property that bordered their old ranch. Her father's signature was clear and bold across the bottom, dated just 6 months before his death. "Silas," she called, her voice strange and tight, "you need to see this." He came immediately, settling beside her on the cabin floor as she spread the documents between them. "What am I looking at?" "My father filed a mining claim. Look at the survey marks. This is the eastern section of our old ranch, the part that backed up against Copper Creek." Martha's hands trembled as she traced the property lines on the crude map. "He found something up there." Silas studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read legal documents during his years of land acquisition. "According to this, the claim is still valid, and it's in your name. He transferred ownership to you 2 weeks before he died." "But that's impossible. He never told me anything about mining, and if he'd found something valuable, why didn't he use it to save the ranch?" Martha rifled through the remaining papers and found her answer a letter in her father's handwriting, addressed to her but never sent. "My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're going through my things. I pray that means you survived whatever comes after I'm no longer here to protect you. The mining claim is real, and what I found up on Copper Creek is more valuable than I ever dared hope. Silver ore, rich veins of it, enough to pay off every debt and restore our family's honor. But by the time I found it, I was already too sick to work the claim, and I feared what would happen if word got out before I could secure your future. The men in town who hold our debts, they've been circling like vultures, waiting for me to die so they can pick the bones of what we built. If they knew about the silver, they'd find a way to take it from you, claim you're unfit to manage such wealth, find some legal means to steal what's rightfully yours. Better to let them think they've won, let them believe there's nothing left worth taking. When the time is right, when you're strong enough and have allies you can trust, then you can claim what's yours. You are worth so much more than they'll ever see, my darling girl. Don't let their small minds convince you otherwise. All my love, your father." Martha read the letter twice before the words truly sank in. When they did, she felt as if the earth had shifted beneath her feet. "I'm not poor," she whispered. "All this time, I thought I had nothing left, that I was nothing more than a burden, but I have this." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with growing understanding. "This changes everything. The people in town, the ones who've been so cruel, who drove me out, who put up that poster, they think I'm worthless. They think I'm a beggar, a thief, someone who deserves to sleep with pigs." Martha's voice grew stronger with each word. "But I own something they want, something they've probably been planning to claim for themselves once they thought I was gone for good. The $50 reward," Silas said slowly. "It's not about justice or theft. They want you back in town where they can control you, manipulate you into signing over rights you don't even know you have." Martha thought about the men who'd ridden up to the cabin, their aggressive insistence that she return, their claims that she had no business being with a decent man. It hadn't been about morality at all, it had been about money. "They must know about the mining claim," she said. "Some of them anyway. That's why they've been so determined to drag me back." "The question is," Silas said carefully, "what do you want to do about it?" Martha looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the simple life she'd been building with this good man who'd seen value in her when no one else could. Part of her wanted to burn the papers, to pretend she'd never found them, to continue living in peaceful obscurity where her worth wasn't measured in silver ore and legal documents. But another part of her, a part that sounded like her father's voice, whispered that running away wouldn't change the fundamental problem. Those people in town would continue to hurt others like her, would continue to use shame and cruelty as weapons against anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of acceptable. "I want them to know," she said finally. "I want them to understand that the woman they cast aside, the woman they convinced was worthless, the woman they treated like an animal, I want them to know that she's worth more than all of them combined." Silas nodded slowly. "That's going to mean going back, facing them directly." "I know. They won't make it easy. Even with legal documents, they'll try to find ways to challenge your claim, to paint you as unfit or incompetent. Let them try." Martha carefully folded the papers, feeling stronger than she had in years. "I've got something now that I didn't have before. The mining claim." "No," Martha said, meeting his eyes. "I've got someone who believes in me. Someone who's shown me that my worth doesn't depend on their approval." She reached for his hand. "That changes everything." Silas squeezed her fingers gently. "Whatever you decide to do, I'll stand with you. Even if it means leaving this peaceful life behind. Even if it means fighting battles that aren't really yours." "Martha," Silas said, his voice soft but certain, "your battles became mine the moment I decided I couldn't live without you." The words sent warmth flooding through Martha's chest. For the first time since she'd found the documents, she allowed herself to truly consider what they meant. Not just financial security, but power. The power to stand up to those who'd crushed her spirit. The power to help others who found themselves in similar circumstances. The power to prove that a person's value couldn't be determined by their appearance or social status. But most importantly, it meant she could offer Silas a partnership of equals, not a broken woman grateful for scraps of kindness, but a woman of means who chose to love him not out of desperation, but out of genuine feeling. "There's something else," she said, her heart racing with the audacity of what she was about to suggest. "Something I want to ask you, but I need you to know that your answer won't change how I feel about you." Silas waited patiently, giving her time to find her courage. "When this is all settled, when I've claimed what's mine and faced down those people in town, would you consider marrying me? Not because I need rescuing, but because I can't imagine building a life with anyone else." The smile that spread across Silas's weathered face was like sunrise after the longest night of winter. "Martha Jenkins," he said, "I thought you'd never ask." The preparation took 3 days, but Martha approached each task with the methodical patience her father had taught her when planning ranch operations. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, dignity, and reclaiming her rightful place in a world that had tried to erase her. On the first day, she and Silas rode to the county seat to verify the legal standing of her mining claim. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, confirmed what the documents had stated. Martha Jenkins was the legal owner of mining rights to a significant portion of what had once been the Triple Creek Ranch. "Valuable claim," the clerk noted, consulting his records. "There have been inquiries about it, men asking if it was available for purchase, if the owner might be interested in selling." "What kind of men?" Silas asked. "Town council members from Cedar Falls, mostly. Banker named Morrison. Merchant called Patterson. They seemed quite interested in acquiring the rights." Martha and Silas exchanged glances. The pieces were falling into place, the sudden interest in her return, the reward poster, the pressure to bring her back to town. They'd been planning to manipulate her into selling the claim for a fraction of its worth, probably convincing her she was lucky to get anything at all. On the second day, Martha insisted on visiting the mining site itself. It was a hard ride up narrow mountain trails to reach Copper Creek, but when they arrived, she understood why her father had been so hopeful. The creek ran clear and cold over rocks that glinted with silver ore, and the shaft he'd begun to dig showed rich veins of metal threading through the stone. "It's real," Martha said, kneeling by the creek and running her fingers through the icy water. "All of it. We really were sitting on a fortune all those years." "Your father was a smart man," Silas observed, examining the mining equipment her father had cached nearby. "He knew this would change everything for you." Martha found something else hidden near the mining site, a small leather journal, her father's final gift. Inside, pressed between pages of careful notes about ore samples and extraction methods, were wildflowers he'd picked for her mother years ago, along with letters he'd written but never sent. The letters spoke of his love for both his late wife and his daughter, his regrets about not protecting Martha better from the town's cruelty, and his hopes that someday she would find happiness with someone who could see her true worth. The final entry, written just days before his death, spoke of a man he'd met, a mountain man, who'd helped him with supplies and seemed to possess both strength and kindness in equal measure. "I find myself hoping that if something happens to me, Martha might cross paths with Silas McGraw. He strikes me as the sort of man who judges character rather than appearances, who would see the treasure in my daughter that others have been too blind to recognize." Martha looked up from the journal to find Silas watching her with gentle curiosity. "My father wrote about you," she said softly. "He hoped we'd meet." "Smart man," Silas replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd already known about her father's wishes. On the third day, they planned their approach to Cedar Falls. Martha had transformed during their preparations, not physically, though good food and mountain air had brought color back to her cheeks, but in presence, in the way she carried herself. She stood straighter now, spoke with quiet authority, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone worth defending rather than someone deserving of shame. "I want to do this properly," she told Silas as they reviewed their strategy. "Not in anger, not in revenge, but with dignity. I want to show them exactly who they tried to destroy." They would arrive in town during the weekly market day, when most of the population would be gathered in the central square. Martha would present her legal claim publicly, establish her ownership of the mining rights, and make it clear that she was no longer the broken woman they'd driven away. "There's something else," Martha said, her hand moving instinctively to the cloth bundle that contained her mother's wedding ring. "I want to ask them why. Why they felt the need to be so cruel to someone who was already suffering. What satisfaction they found in kicking someone who was already down." "You might not like the answers," Silas warned gently. "I know, but I need to understand. If I'm going to move forward, if I'm going to build something better, I need to understand what I'm working to change." That evening, their last night before the confrontation, Martha sat by the fireplace reading from her father's Bible, another artifact from the trunk that had revealed her inheritance. The pages were well worn, filled with pressed flowers and loving notes written in the margins, proof that her father had never stopped believing in her worth. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. Martha read aloud from Proverbs, her finger tracing words her father had underlined. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. "Your father marked that passage?" Silas asked, settling beside her on the small sofa they'd moved closer to the fire. "Among others." "Look." Martha showed him page after page of carefully highlighted verses about worth, courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. He was preparing me for this moment, even then, teaching me that my value doesn't come from what others think of me. Silas studied the marginalia scripture references connected by her father's careful hand, building a theological argument for dignity and self-worth that had nothing to do with social approval. "He loved you very much," Silas said quietly. "Yes, he did. And he believed I was strong enough to handle the truth about the mining claim when the time came." Martha closed the Bible carefully, holding it against her chest. "I won't disappoint him." As they prepared for bed, Martha found herself studying Silas with new eyes. Tomorrow would test everything they'd built together, would reveal whether their love could withstand public scrutiny and social pressure. But tonight, in the warm glow of firelight, she felt nothing but certainty. "Are you nervous?" she asked, as he banked the fire for the night. "About tomorrow? No." Silas straightened, meeting her eyes across the cabin. "I'm proud. Proud to stand beside you, proud to be chosen by someone with your courage. What if they're cruel? What if they say things about us, about you for choosing me? Then they'll prove themselves to be exactly what we already know they are." Silas moved to her, taking her hands in his. "Martha, do you remember what you asked me the other day, about whether I'd consider marrying you?" She nodded, suddenly breathless. "I've been thinking about that, about what it would mean, what kind of life we could build together." His thumbs stroked across her knuckles, a gesture that had become familiar and precious. "I know we plan to face the town first, to settle the business with your inheritance, but I keep thinking, why wait? Why give them the satisfaction of witnessing something so private and beautiful?" Martha's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you're willing, I'd like to marry you tonight. Here, in front of the fire, with the mountains as our witnesses. Let tomorrow be about justice and dignity and proving your worth to people who should have seen it all along. But tonight could be about love." Martha looked at this man who'd found her sleeping with pigs and seen someone worth saving, who'd offered her safety and grown into offering her partnership, who'd stood between her and those who would harm her without hesitation or regret. "Yes," she whispered, and the words seemed to light up the cabin brighter than any fire. "Yes, I want to marry you tonight." As Silas went to retrieve her mother's wedding ring from its hiding place, Martha felt the last pieces of her broken heart clicking into place. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and challenge, but tonight would bring something infinitely more precious. The moment when Martha Jenkins stopped being a woman in need of rescue and became Martha McGraw, equal partner to a man who'd learned to see her as clearly as she was learning to see herself. The marriage ceremony had been simple and perfect, just the two of them, the fire crackling in the hearth, and promises spoken with the mountains as witnesses. Now, as Martha rode beside her husband toward Cedar Falls, she felt the weight of her mother's wedding ring on her finger and the strength that came from knowing she was no longer facing the world alone. Market day had drawn crowds from throughout the valley, and the town square buzzed with activity when Martha and Silas arrived. Conversations gradually quieted as people noticed them, whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples across still water. Martha heard her name spoken with surprise, disgust, curiosity, and something that might have been fear. She dismounted slowly, deliberately, giving everyone time to see that she was not the broken woman who'd fled months ago. Clean, well-fed, dressed in simple but dignified clothing, she carried herself with quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martha called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. The crowd fell silent, shocked by her boldness in addressing them directly. "I have an announcement to make." From the gathered townspeople, she picked out familiar faces: the banker Morrison, merchant Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, who'd once called her a disgrace, the young men who'd made sport of mocking her weight. All of them stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. "Many of you knew my father, Robert Jenkins of the Triple Creek Ranch," Martha continued. "You knew him as a good man who worked hard and treated his neighbors fairly. When drought and disease destroyed his livelihood, some of you helped him. Others," her gaze swept across certain faces in the crowd, "chose to profit from his misfortune." Banker Morrison stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "Now, see here, Martha. Your father's debts were legitimate business arrangements. No one forced him to mortgage his land." "You're absolutely right," Martha said calmly. "My father made his choices, and he lived with the consequences. But what I've discovered is that he made other choices as well, choices that some of you have been very interested in lately." She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew the legal documents, holding them high enough for everyone to see. "My father filed a mining claim on the eastern section of our old ranch 6 months before his death. A legitimate claim, properly registered with the county, for mineral rights to land rich with silver ore. The reaction was immediate and telling. Morrison's face went pale. Patterson began whispering urgently to the men beside him, and several other townspeople exchanged glances that confirmed Martha's suspicions about who had known about the mining rights. "Furthermore," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger, "my father transferred ownership of those rights to me 2 weeks before his death. Which means that all those inquiries you gentlemen have been making about purchasing abandoned mining claims have been inquiries about stealing my property." "That's impossible," Patterson sputtered. "You can't prove." "I can, and I will." Martha held up the official deed, every document properly filed, every signature witnessed and notarized. "The silver mine belongs to me, and it always has." The town hall gavel, symbol of authority and judgment that had been used against her so many times, lay on a nearby table where the mayor had been preparing to call the weekly meeting to order. Martha walked to it deliberately, picked it up, and held it as she continued speaking. "But ownership of the mine isn't why I'm here today. I'm here because I want to understand something that's puzzled me for months." Martha's gaze swept across the crowd, meeting eyes that had once held only contempt for her. "I want to understand why a community that prided itself on Christian values found such satisfaction in tormenting a woman whose only crime was failing to meet your standards of physical attractiveness." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha saw people looking at their feet, shifting uncomfortably, whispering to each other behind raised hands. "I want to understand why you convinced a grieving daughter that she was responsible for her father's failure, that her very existence was a burden too great for any family to bear." Martha's voice remained calm, but those who knew her could hear the steel beneath the surface. "I want to understand what pleasure you found in driving someone to sleep with pigs because you'd convinced her that's all she deserved." "Now, Martha," Mayor Hendricks stepped forward, his tone condescending, "you're being overly dramatic. No one forced you to—" "To what?" Martha interrupted, her grip tightening on the gavel. "To leave town? To live in poverty? To accept scraps like a stray dog?" She looked directly at him. "You're right, Mayor. No one forced me. You simply made it clear that those were my only options if I wanted to avoid constant humiliation." A voice from the crowd called out, "You brought it on yourself. Always eating too much, never finding a husband, being a burden on your poor father." Martha turned toward the voice, Mrs. Carmichael, the preacher's wife, her face twisted with the self-righteous cruelty that had become so familiar. "Mrs. Carmichael," Martha said politely, "thank you for illustrating my point so perfectly. Tell me, what does your Bible say about how we should treat the least among us? About showing kindness to those who are suffering? About not judging others, lest we be judged ourselves?" The preacher's wife's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. "I'll tell you what it says," Martha continued, her voice ringing with authority. "It says that how we treat the vulnerable reveals our true character. It says that those who show mercy will receive mercy, and those who show cruelty." She let the words hang in the air. Silas, who had remained silent beside the horses, now stepped forward to stand at Martha's shoulder. His presence was calm but unmistakably protective, and several men in the crowd shifted nervously as they remembered the stories about mountain men and their reputation for handling trouble. "What my wife is trying to understand," Silas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd never needed to raise it to be heard, "is how supposedly decent people convinced themselves that cruelty was justified. How you turned a neighbor's grief into entertainment." The word "wife" sent another ripple through the crowd. Martha saw shock, disbelief, and in some faces, a calculating reassessment of the situation. "You married her?" Morrison asked, his voice filled with incredulity. "I married her," Silas confirmed, "because I was smart enough to see what all of you missed, that Martha Jenkins is worth more than this entire town combined." Martha felt a surge of love and gratitude so strong it nearly took her breath away. But she also saw something else in the crowd's reaction, the first glimmerings of understanding that they might have misjudged both the situation and the woman they'd dismissed so easily. "So here's what's going to happen," Martha said, setting the gavel back on the table with deliberate precision. "I'm going to develop my mining claim. I'm going to become a very wealthy woman, and I'm going to use that wealth to ensure that no one else in this community ever has to endure what you put me through." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. "But first," Martha continued, "I want an answer to my question. I want anyone to explain to me what satisfaction you found in breaking someone who was already broken. What did it cost you to show kindness instead of cruelty? What did you gain by driving away someone who might have contributed to this community if you'd given her the chance?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle. Martha waited, giving them time to search their consciences, to confront the ugliness they'd hidden behind social convention and self-righteousness. Finally, a voice spoke from the back of the crowd, old Doc Henderson, who delivered Martha and watched her grow up. "We gained nothing," he said quietly, "and we lost our souls doing it." Doc Henderson's words hung in the air like a confession that opened the floodgates of conscience. Martha saw the impact of his honesty ripple through the crowd, some faces hardening in defensive anger, others crumpling with what looked like genuine shame. "Doc's right," called another voice. This time it was Sarah Miller, the school teacher, her voice shaking with emotion. "We told ourselves we were protecting our children from bad influences, but we were really just teaching them that cruelty was acceptable if the target seemed weak enough." Martha turned toward the teacher, surprised by the support from an unexpected quarter. "What do you mean? The children, they started copying us, making jokes about anyone who looked different, excluding classmates who didn't fit in perfectly. They learned from watching us that some people matter less than others." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I realized I was raising a generation of bullies, and I didn't know how to undo the damage." More voices began to speak tentatively at first, then with growing courage as people found permission to acknowledge what they'd known all along was wrong. "I threw food scraps at you once," admitted young Tommy Patterson, the merchant's son. "My friends dared me to. Said it was funny because you ate like a pig anyway. I felt sick about it for weeks, but I was too scared to apologize." "We told ourselves you were lazy," said Mary Hendricks, the mayor's wife, "that you could lose weight if you really wanted to, that you deserved what happened because you didn't try hard enough. It was easier than admitting we just didn't want to see suffering we weren't willing to help fix. Martha listened to each confession, feeling a complex mix of vindication and sorrow. These were the same people who'd driven her to despair, but hearing their admissions, she could see the fear and insecurity that had motivated their cruelty. "But why?" she asked again, her voice gentler now. "Why was it easier to be cruel than kind?" Banker Morrison, who'd remained silent during the others' confessions, finally spoke. His voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "Because kindness costs something," he said slowly. "It costs time, attention, risk of association with someone deemed unacceptable. Cruelty costs nothing. It even pays dividends in social status, proving you're not one of the undesirable ones." He looked directly at Martha for the first time since she'd arrived. "And because, God help us, there was pleasure in it. In feeling superior, in having someone safe to look down on, in exercising power over someone who couldn't fight back." The brutal honesty of his admission sent a shudder through the crowd. Martha felt Silas's hand find hers, a steady anchor in the storm of emotion. "At least you're honest about it," Martha said to Morrison, though her voice carried more sadness than anger. "That's more than I expected." She looked around the crowd, seeing them differently now, not as monsters, but as flawed people who'd let fear and social pressure turn them into something uglier than they'd intended to become. "I came here expecting to find satisfaction in proving you wrong," Martha continued, "in showing you that the woman you threw away was worth more than you could imagine. And I have proven that my mining claim is worth more money than most of you will see in a lifetime." She reached into her jacket and withdrew something that made several people in the crowd gasp: 2 simple gold wedding bands, handmade and gleaming in the afternoon sun. "But I've discovered something more valuable than silver ore," Martha said, holding up the rings. "I've discovered what it feels like to be loved for exactly who I am, to have someone see value in me, not despite my flaws, but including them." She turned to Silas, who stepped forward with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Silas McGraw, in front of all these witnesses, I want to say again what I said to you last night by our fire. I choose you, not because I need rescuing, but because I can't imagine sharing my life with anyone else." "And I choose you," Silas replied, taking her hands in his, "because you've shown me what courage looks like, what grace under pressure means, and what it feels like to love someone who makes me want to be a better man." He slipped one of the rings onto her finger, and she placed the other on his. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by a crowd that had gathered to see her humiliated, and instead found themselves observing something beautiful and transformative. "You're really married," whispered someone in the crowd, the words carrying wonder rather than disbelief. "We are," Martha confirmed, looking at her new husband with eyes that shone with happiness. "And we're going to build a life together, based on seeing the best in each other, rather than the worst." She turned back to the crowd, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd found her power, not in revenge, but in understanding. "I forgive you," she said simply. "All of you. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying anger would poison the happiness I've found." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people began to weep openly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Martha continued. "It doesn't mean pretending that words and actions don't have consequences. What happened to me will never happen to anyone else in this town if I have anything to say about it." Mayor Hendricks stepped forward, his official demeanor finally replaced by something more human. "What do you want from us, Martha? What would make this right?" Martha considered the question carefully. "I want you to remember. I want you to remember what it felt like to hear those confessions today, to see yourselves clearly for what you became. And I want you to choose differently the next time you encounter someone who's struggling, someone who doesn't fit your idea of perfect." She gestured toward the schoolteacher. "I want children in this town to learn that every person has value, regardless of how they look or what challenges they face. I want them to understand that kindness is always a choice, and it's always the right choice. And I want to establish a fund, Martha added, surprising even herself with the decision that crystallized as she spoke. A portion of the profits from my mining operation will go toward helping people who find themselves in desperate circumstances, people who need food, shelter, or just someone to believe in their worth when they've forgotten it themselves. The crowd was silent, absorbing the magnitude of what she was offering. Not punishment, but redemption. Not revenge, but transformation. Doc Henderson spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a better person than we deserve, Martha McGraw." "Maybe," Martha said with a slight smile. "But I learned something important on that mountain. People become better when they're given the chance to be better, when someone sees potential in them and refuses to give up on it." She looked at Silas, whose steady presence had been the foundation upon which she'd rebuilt her sense of self-worth. "My husband showed me what I was capable of becoming when someone believed in me. Maybe this town can learn the same lesson." As Martha and Silas prepared to leave, people began approaching them individually, some to offer apologies, others to ask hesitant questions about how they might contribute to the fund she'd mentioned, still others simply to look closely at the woman they'd driven away and see clearly what they'd failed to recognize before. Martha accepted each interaction with grace, seeing in these tentative overtures the first signs that real change might be possible. Not immediate, not perfect, but genuine progress toward becoming the kind of community that lifted people up rather than tearing them down. As they mounted their horses to return to the mountain, Banker Morrison called out one last question. "Will you stay? Will you live here again?" Martha looked at the town square, at the faces turned toward her with mixtures of hope and uncertainty, at the place that had been the source of so much pain but might yet become something better. "We'll visit," she said finally. "We'll be part of this community's healing, but our home is in the mountains now, where we learn to see each other clearly." She smiled, and for the first time since her return, it was a smile entirely free of pain or defensiveness. Some of the most beautiful views require a little distance to appreciate properly. 1 year later, Martha McGraw stood before her sewing machine in the sun-drenched workroom of their expanded mountain cabin, putting the finishing touches on a dress that would have seemed impossible to imagine when Silas first found her sleeping among pigs. The fabric was simple blue cotton, nothing fancy or expensive, but it had been cut and sewn with care, designed to fit the body she had rather than the body others thought she should possess. The dress represented more than clothing. It was a declaration of self-acceptance, sewn by her own hands, beautiful in its simplicity and perfect fit. Martha had learned to make garments that celebrated her figure rather than hiding it, that reflected her personality rather than conforming to others' expectations. Each stitch was an act of rebellion against years of shame, each careful seam a testament to her newfound understanding of her own worth. "It's beautiful," Silas said from the doorway, where he'd been watching her work, with the quiet appreciation that had become as natural as breathing between them. "It's me," Martha replied, holding up the finished dress to admire her handiwork. "Finally, completely me." Their life together had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as the changing seasons. The mining operation provided more wealth than either had expected, enough to live comfortably, enough to fund the assistance program Martha had established for people in desperate circumstances, enough to prove that her father's faith in the claim had been well-founded. But the real riches were smaller, daily things. The way Silas still brought her coffee each morning, prepared exactly as she liked it. The way she'd learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders after a day of hard work. The conversations that could last deep into the night, or the comfortable silences that needed no words at all. The cabin itself had grown to accommodate their expanding life. A larger kitchen where Martha could cook for the steady stream of visitors who came seeking help or simply drawn by the warmth of their hospitality. A workshop where Silas crafted furniture and tools with the same patient attention he'd once given to his carved comb. A library where they spent winter evenings reading aloud to each other from books ordered from distant cities. But perhaps most importantly, they'd added a guest room, a space specifically designed to offer temporary sanctuary to people who found themselves in circumstances similar to what Martha had faced. Over the past year, they'd housed a young woman fleeing an abusive marriage, an elderly man whose family had abandoned him, a family whose farm had failed and who needed time to rebuild their lives with dignity and tact. Each guest taught them something new about the many forms human suffering could take and the many ways that simple kindness could begin the process of healing. Martha had discovered that her own experience of being cast out and restored gave her unique insight into helping others navigate similar journeys. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Silas went to answer it and returned with Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher who'd become an unexpected ally and friend in the months since Martha's dramatic return to town. "I hope I'm not intruding," Sarah said, though her smile suggested she knew she was always welcome. "I have news about the scholarship fund." Martha set down her sewing and gestured for Sarah to sit by the fire, where coffee was always ready for visitors. "Good news, I hope?" "Better than good. We've received applications from 12 young people who want to continue their education, but whose families can't afford to send them away to school. Smart, motivated children who might otherwise never get the chance to develop their potential." The scholarship fund had been Martha's idea, a way to ensure that poverty didn't become a barrier to education in their community. She'd seen too many bright minds wasted because their families couldn't afford books and tuition, too many dreams abandoned because no one believed they were worth investing in. 12, Martha repeated, pleased. "That's wonderful. Have you had a chance to review their essays?" "I have." And Martha. Sarah's voice grew thick with emotion. "Several of them wrote about you, about what your story meant to them, about learning that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions." Sarah pulled out a folded paper from her bag. "May I read you something? This is from Emma Patterson, you remember, the merchant's daughter. She's applied to study medicine." With Martha's nod, Sarah began to read. "I used to think that being different was something to be ashamed of. I watched how the adults in my town treated Mrs. McGraw before she married, and I learned that people who didn't fit the normal expectations were fair targets for cruelty. But when she came back and showed us who she really was, strong, intelligent, successful, and worthy of love, I realized that the problem was never with her. The problem was with us for being too small-minded to see her value. I want to become a doctor because I want to heal people, but not just their bodies. I want to help heal the kind of thinking that makes communities turn against their own members. I want to be the kind of person who sees potential where others see problems, who offers help where others offer judgment. Mrs. McGraw showed me that the most important thing isn't whether you fit in, it's whether you have the courage to be exactly who you're meant to be, even when that's difficult or unpopular. She taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." Martha felt tears gathering in her eyes. "She wrote that?" "She did, and she's not the only one. Your story has changed how these young people think about difference, about kindness, about what it means to be part of a community." After Sarah left, Martha and Silas walked together through their mountain meadow, where wildflowers bloomed in profusion and the air carried the clean scent of pine and possibility. It was the same walk they'd taken countless times over the past year, but Martha never tired of the view, the peak stretching endlessly toward the horizon, the creek running clear and cold through rocks that still glinted with silver, the cabin nestled among trees like something from a dream of home. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked as they paused beside the creek where her father had discovered their fortune. "Giving up the chance for revenge? You could have destroyed the people who hurt you." Martha considered the question, running her hand through the icy water where silver ore caught the afternoon light. What would that have accomplished? They would have suffered, I would have remained bitter, and nothing good would have grown from the pain. She straightened, wiping her wet hand on her skirt. This way, helping Emma Patterson become a doctor, providing sanctuary for people who need it, teaching children that kindness is always a choice. This way creates something lasting and beautiful. Even for the people who hurt you, especially for them. They have to live with the knowledge of what they became, but they also get the chance to become something better. That's a gift, not a punishment. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Martha and Silas made their way back to their cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, dinner waited on the stove, and the evening stretched ahead of them, full of quiet contentment and the easy intimacy of two people who'd learned to see each other clearly. Before going inside, Martha paused to look back at the valley below, where the lights of Cedar Falls were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. It was no longer a place of pain for her, but neither was it home. Home was here, in this mountain sanctuary, with this man who'd seen worth in her, when she couldn't see it in herself. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, following her gaze. "I'm thinking about that night you found me," Martha said softly. "When you asked why I was sleeping with pigs, I told you it was because they were the only creatures who didn't look at me like I was disgusting. I remember. I was wrong, though. It wasn't that they saw me differently. It was that they saw me clearly as someone who needed warmth and companionship and simple acceptance. They didn't judge me or find me wanting. They just saw someone who belonged there with them in that moment." Martha turned to face her husband, this mountain man who'd taught her that love wasn't about becoming acceptable to others, but about accepting yourself completely. "You were the first human being to see me that way," she said, "to look at me and see someone who belonged exactly where she was." Silas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "And you were the first person to make me understand that belonging isn't something you achieve by changing yourself to fit other people's expectations. It's something you create when you find someone who sees the world the same way you do." As they walked through their door together, Martha caught sight of herself in the window glass, not the broken woman she'd been a year ago, but someone confident and loved and certain of her place in the world. The reflection showed a woman wearing a simple blue dress that fit perfectly, a gold wedding ring that caught the firelight, and an expression of deep contentment that spoke of someone who'd finally come home to herself. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with the sound of ancient wisdom, and somewhere in the distance, nightbirds called to each other across the darkness. Inside their warm cabin, Martha and Silas McGraw settled into another evening of the life they'd built together, a life founded not on society's approval, but on the radical revolutionary act of seeing clearly, loving completely, and refusing to let the world's cruelty diminish their capacity for joy. The woman who'd once slept with pigs because she'd been told that's all she deserved had become a woman who slept each night in the arms of someone who cherished her exactly as she was. And in the morning, she would wake up ready to continue the work of building a world where such transformation was possible for anyone brave enough to believe they deserved it.